Hello, hello. This is the Drupal 7 End of Life podcast. I am here, Mark Dorison, today without Chris Free. Chris is on sabbatical, but I am joined by a special guest, Jen Lampton. Jen is a member of the Backdrop Project Management Committee. She's a provisional member of the Drupal security team, and that is super interesting on a number of levels. But we have talked so much across some of these episodes about the Backdrop community and the Drupal community. And in addition to being a part of those communities, Jen is firmly in both of those communities, and has been involved, especially with Backdrop, since the earliest days. So, welcome, Jen. First of all.
First, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. First off, I'm curious for those who maybe have heard the name Backdrop or maybe just know a little bit about it, as it's come up for some of us much more frequently in the discussion around Drupal 7 End of Life. But Backdrop has been around for a while. Can you give us like a short version of the history of Backdrop?
Sure. For those who don't know, Backdrop is a free open content management system, just like Drupal, and it has a very different audience. So when Drupal made the decision to sort of pivot towards enterprise and try and include a bunch of features and benefits to the enterprise audience, Backdrop said, we're going to go the other way. The enterprise already has a fantastic free open source content management system, but there are some people who are feeling left behind. And so how do we give all of those people the same features that they would need in a way that is more palatable to the way that they work? And so we tried to create a parallel product. So Backdrop and modern Drupal have many of the same features included, many of the same improvements, but they're implemented in very different ways for each project because each audience has different priorities. And so Backdrop is essentially, what if you don't share priorities with enterprise software and still want a more modern tool than Drupal 7 was. So back in the very beginning, Backdrop was born from basically two different perspectives. Mine, I'm an independent contractor, meaning most of the sites that I work on are not enterprise sites. They're small, usually local businesses, often nonprofits, higher education, a lot of groups that don't necessarily have like a budget devoted to their website. They have a budget and they have to find parts of that to spend on their website. And for me, I tend to have long-term relationships with the websites that I work on. A lot of them started in Drupal 5. I have one I'm working on that started in Drupal 4.7. And I work with the clients and adapt their sites to whatever they need at any given time for their business. And every time we hit an upgrade in Drupal's history, 4.7 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, et cetera, there's always a pain point for them where they're like, oh, I have to make this investment because it's, better software, but like, what do I get for it out of my business? And in a lot of cases, we skipped an upgrade. I did a lot of 5 to 7. I did a lot of 6 to Backdrop, right? Because they can't necessarily afford to keep up with the speed of software development.
Right.
And so for those people, I knew when I was working on Drupal 8 core that I could not go back to them and feel good about presenting an estimate about what it would cost to get them to Drupal 8. I knew that these organizations weren't going to be able to afford it. I knew that a lot of the benefits that were going into Drupal 8 weren't going to benefit them. And it didn't feel good I didn't feel good about selling it to them, about pitching it to it. And so I was like, well, what are these people going to do? Like when we get there, what does their future look like? And, I love Drupal. I've invested thousands of hours of my life into this platform, not only in the code, but in, running community events. Like I ran the Bad Camp Bay Area Drupal Camp for 10 years here. I was one of the organizers for DrupalCon San Francisco. It was just like countless hours and effort and passion into this platform. And I believe in it. Like Drupal 7 is good software. Granted, it's old now, right? It needs a lot of updates, but I still felt like it was a solid base for these people. And if we could move it forward in a way that benefited them, we could also have another good open source software platform. And Nate, my now husband, ran a software as a service platform. He was the maintainer for web form module, and he had a website called webform.com where you could create web forms. And then not only was your data fully exportable, which you can't get from like SurveyorMonkey or anything, but you could also download a whole Drupal website that would then run your data, right? So not only is your data like free, but your software platform is also free. And so it was very much like you can do whatever you want with this. If you start with 10 forms, now you have a website with 10 forms and you can do it yourself. And he was looking at what is it going to take for him as someone who provides software as a service and has invested heavily in the Drupal 7 platform to move his service to the next version. And he was looking at like the cost benefit. And for him, there's no benefit. What he gets out is exactly what he put in. And those clients get nothing new. Like all of his customers get nothing new for that investment. And so he, from these very two different perspectives, me, where it's like I'm working with the little guys with the little investments, and he's looking at the big scale with the big investment. And both of us came to like, we need another option for Drupal. And for me, I was very busy working on the Twig initiative at the time. So I was like, well, we'll just see where Drupal lands. Like, you know, this is important. I'm going to do this now. Right. And when Drupal gets somewhere else, we can make a decision. And for him, he was working on getting CK Editor into core. And it just hit him when he had a patch that was marked ready to be committed. And then Symfony went in. Mm-hmm. And his patch that was ready to be committed needed to be entirely rewritten. And he just got a flash forward of like, okay, so all of core is being entirely written. All of contrib is going to need to be entirely rewritten. All of the custom code is going to need to be entirely rewritten. That's too much. And right. So he just sort of went off to GitHub and like just tinkered a little bit about like what could it look like if it was a more modern version of Drupal 7 without some of these more drastic changes. And of course, people in the Drupal community found it. And he was like, well, I wasn't really ready to say anything. It was just an experiment. But then he had to write like a blog post sort of explaining the necessity for this like parallel piece of software. So both of us came to it from, you know, very different personal experiences, but sort of thinking about the needs of the community and trying to say like, you know, I have people in the Drupal community who I'm serving and he has people he's serving, and how do we make sure that everybody gets a solution for their future? And after it came out, we were working on this, we had like this huge pouring of interest where some people were like very upset, right? And they were like, why is this happening? How could you do this? What have you? And some people were like, yes, finally. They're very excited. And so in the beginning, we had a whole bunch of people who came to it with, you know, their own motivations and drivers. A bunch of people who'd been in the Drupal community for a very long time, a handful of people who'd never contributed in Drupal because they felt they weren't needed, and came to Backdrop and said, oh, finally, here's a, you know, a community where I can make a big difference, and jumped right in.
So to set the table a little bit, we've talked a lot in past episodes about, you know, why we're here and why we're having this discussion. The Drupal 7 is scheduled to reach end of life. There's still approximately 400,000 sites that are still on Drupal 7. So, and also, you know, I stole this from Arena, but Arena talked about how, you know, both Backdrop and modern Drupal are both descendants of Drupal 7. So, and they've diverged. You talked a little bit just now about some of the priorities for you and Nate and others early in Backdrop. Like, what were the priorities and how were those priorities different than the direction that modern Drupal went? Now, I would say that today, I believe that modern Drupal is a great CMS, and I you know, believe Backdrop is a great CMS, and maybe they serve different people with different priorities. I think the you know, the problem that we're talking about, and you highlighted quite well, is, you know, some number of those 400,000 people that are in some ways stuck on Drupal 7, where they built a site on a platform that was great at the time, and now it's just quite long in the tooth. And how do we get them to a supported version of some software, whether that is modern Drupal, whether that is Backdrop, or, you know, whether that is something else? What's changed for Backdrop? You know, jumping around a little bit, but you highlighted the priorities for, you know, Backdrop at the beginning. Has very much changed 10 years. It has been 10 years. You know, 10 years in, or what has stayed, you know, consistently the same?
Yeah, so when we originally came up with our announcement, we had to sort of think about like how did Drupal end up where it is, right? And a bunch of us went and dug around in Drupal's history and found like their philosophy page, and we looked at what was written on the page, and we looked at Drupal 8, and we're like, some of this doesn't line up anymore. The philosophy
Mm.
page was very old, right? And so it's the kind of thing where it's like the community has evolved past what this page says on it. So there are a lot of people in the community who doesn't really know what Drupal's like modern philosophy is. Like right now, it's like getting off the island. There's a bunch of stuff that just wasn't even thought of when that page was written.
Right.
And so we thought, well, some of us are really more in line with the philosophies that were written in previous iterations of Drupal whenever that page was first written. And what would it look like if modern Drupal stuck to those? And so we thought, well, okay, well, if we write down the same list, what's to stop Backdrop from becoming Drupal 8 too, right? Like, how do we keep our project in line with our goals? And so we wrote down our philosophy. We wrote down the things that we thought were most important. Number one, based on where we were starting off, was that backwards compatibility is important. The thing that made Drupal change, some things were really hard between major versions. Like, just for the history of Drupal, this has always been a pain point. It's our number one priority. And we wrote down a bunch of other things, and we said, okay, well, in order to make sure Backdrop sticks to this, we need like a governing body that is capable of evaluating all of the changes that are going into core and not measuring them on whether I want this change in core or not, which is a lot of what happens in Drupal. There are a lot of people arguing their own perspective of things. But are they capable to look at the feature and look at the priority set and say, is this in line with the philosophy? So they're coming to it with their own perspective and their own, we call them like a constituent, like they have to represent some group of the community, and they have, we trust their expertise to weigh in on that, but they still compare it against the philosophy of the project. And when we get to a point where we feel like the philosophy needs to change, our process is to change the philosophy first and then put in the change in core that now aligns with the philosophy. And so since we wrote the philosophy, I don't think anything that's on there has changed, but we have added new principles into what's important to Backdrop. And one of the ones that we've added most recent is security, something that's really important to us. And that's come up, through the history of what's happened to Drupal, how the projects collaborate, how we handle those issues, and trying to get more features into core that are going to benefit people who might not know any better, right? So trying to like protect people who like wouldn't know to go and install a specific module in order to get those benefits. So yeah, just again, the way our philosophy works is in some ways really different to how Drupal is. Drupal development is often driven by like core developers identifying big needs and putting in things. And for us, we're saying, look, like what core developers need is not important.
Right.
And what contrib developers need is fairly important. But what the people who have the highest needs are the people who are less capable of doing those things for themselves. Like they can't write a module, they can't submit something to core to fix a bug. We have to take care of those people first. And once their needs are met, then we can look at what the contrib community needs to support that community. And then we can look at what the core community needs to support the contrib community to support that community. So we're just flipping it around and thinking about it the opposite direction. And so some of our new principles have been added specifically to foster that sort of backwards mentality of thinking about the people who need the help the most first.
One of the unique challenges to this situation that we're in with 400,000 sites still on Drupal 7, I believe, is because it's such a hard transition off of Drupal 7, especially with a lot of custom code. And I think what you just mentioned is something that's been knocking around in my head, is that the people that are most suited to make that transition easier, to build further tooling that could to help that transition, have long since moved on from Drupal 7. And I don't particularly blame them for that. This is a open source community, and we're working on, many people are, contributing their own time to working on things that move the needle for them. But it's a unique challenge, I think, that, the people that are still on Drupal 7, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but, are maybe not as a whole, the folks most well suited to create the next groundbreaking tool that will make getting off Drupal 7 easier, especially at this point
Yep.
down the road.
Yep.
Does that track for you?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like the early adopters, right? Those are the ones that had to fight those early battles to make that transition. They're already there. They fought, they built the bridge, they crossed it. And the people who are back on the other side are looking at the bridge going, I don't know if that'll support me anymore. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's just maybe not the same path that they need to take to get there. Yeah, that's definitely something that's on our mind constantly because, one of the things that makes Drupal an amazing piece of software is that it is infinitely flexible and you can do so many things with it. But that means that everybody's experience of going across that bridge is going to be really different. And it's hard to guarantee that be a smooth transition because we don't know what the starting point is for many of these people. And so having a migration tool allows you to make that a custom experience every time, right? Like you take whatever you had in Drupal 7 and you build the pathway to wherever you're going, whether it's Drupal 10 or WordPress or wherever you're going, you can create that custom experience. But it does require a level of like technical expertise to do that. And with Backdrop, we don't have a migration path. It's an upgrade the same way Drupal 6 to 7 went. So hopefully a lot less painful than that. But we're trying to automate as much of that process as possible. But with an infinite starting point, it does make it really hard. So, how do you make that pain less severe for all of those people? We're trying, we've got a lot of tools too. We're trying to, help with information. We're trying to help with instructions. We're trying to help with the actual process of doing the upgrade. We're trying to help connecting people who don't know how to do it with people who do know how to do it. It's just but there's so much that could possibly happen in that transition that it is very hard to guarantee that that's going to be easy. You mentioned this before a little bit, but like future versions of Drupal, right, have promised that this upgrade path is going to be easier, like 8 to 9, 9 to 10, etc. Future versions of Backdrop have also done the same thing. Like, Backdrop 2 will just remove all the stuff that was deprecated in Backdrop 1, and we have a bunch of stuff that's deprecated that's on the chopping block. And I think that, both projects have learned this lesson, right? And some, we've learned it through Drupal. They've learned it through modern Drupal, but yeah, just the same sort of thing. It's always going to be hard, and we've got to find a way to make that easier for everyone going forward.
Would you have guessed 10 years ago when Backdrop was created that Drupal 7 would not yet have reached end of life in 2023?
Maybe. I mean, I feel like we saw this coming, right? We knew that people on Drupal 7 were going to have a really hard time moving to Drupal 8. I don't know that I would have predicted that Drupal 8 would have been end of life by now. I think I would have anticipated that the number of sites that are on Drupal 7 today would still be on Drupal 7. I don't know that I would have known what the security team would have done about that in terms of continuing to extend support to those people. So I probably would have imagined it'd be more like Drupal 6, where we would have a long-term support option and half the sites would be on Drupal 7 long-term support. Some percentage of them would be abandoned entirely, and some of them would be maintaining them themselves. So that's sort of what I envisioned.
What do you think we should be doing differently for the 400,000 folks, the 400,000 sites that are still on Drupal 7? Especially in the first couple episodes of the podcast, Chris and I sort of wrestled with, this idea of Drupal 7's end of life as something that has to be done. And, but I think there's certainly different ways that it can be approached. And I think already the Drupal community has tried approaching it a couple different ways and has extended it a couple times already, some of which partially due to COVID, but now, it is slated for November 2023. There is an escape hatch that they could change their minds by July. If that does happen, I expect it will happen next month at DrupalCon. But that aside, even if, to me, even if they extended another year, that's just moving the date. We're still going to be in a similar situation, but should our strategy or our tactics change beyond the date? Like, what are we doing that we could be doing differently, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a really hard question. I feel like in the backdrop world, we're very much focusing on making the upgrade process easier for people. Like we actually forked from early version of Drupal 8. In hindsight, we would have forked from like the latest release of Drupal 7, but we forked from an early version of Drupal 8, and we already got some API changes in there that are breaking changes. And so what we're trying to do is going back and like adding the backwards compatibility in that wasn't included in early Drupal 8, where changes like that in backdrop always include backwards compatibility. But there are some pain points. There are things that change that we're like, well, this is something that everyone who's upgrading to Drupal 7 is going to hit this issue with entity API or whatever it was that like didn't quite get sorted out. And so we're trying to figure out like, okay, well, if we can fix that for everyone, the upgrade process is going to be smoother. If we can, add in new properties on old objects or whatever it is, more procedural wrapper functions for all of the object-oriented code that's in backdrop, just stuff that can help that process get easier in a way that it'll affect that people who are using contrib, because that's the biggest question mark is, we can do everything we can for core, but no one's running a Drupal site on core alone.
Right.
Well, maybe some people are, very few.
Yep.
And so, yeah, like trying to make that process trying to make the information easier. Like, how do you know, especially from we've got a massive community of Drupal developers who don't know how similar Backdrop is to Drupal. So how do we build them a report that'll show them like where the effort is needed in order to move the site? Like they've never done it before. They don't know if it's going to be easy or hard. And it is until they have some experience that they start to get confident in those estimate numbers, right? So how can we make that process easier for them? So I think for us, it's very much about like, how do we get the information across and make it as similar as possible and then tell people as similar as the two steps that are around. I would say for Drupal, they're also doing a lot of work on trying to make it easier with the migration tools, Drupal to Drupal migrate, that's trying to build some of those paths. But there's also just a lot of the way that things are done in modern Drupal that's different than how they were done in Drupal 7. And those are seen as improvements, and they don't necessarily have upgrade paths in the same way. You have to build them differently. Like you have to think about the problem differently and solve it differently. And so I would say I would see as the biggest pain point in moving from Drupal to modern Drupal 7 to modern Drupal, is that some of those things just you have to know what they are. And then you have to figure out how to, like, what is the modern way to think about that, and then how to just come up with some way to get from your old solution to your new solution.
Yeah.
And because of the migration, a lot of them don't have upgrade paths because people are like, oh, it's no problem, I'll just build it new. But if you don't know that, like the Drupal migrate is great because it sort of builds the modern Drupal piece that you don't know about. But for the stuff that doesn't have that already, that I think is going to be the biggest pain point for people. Like if we could give people examples of like how to get off of field collection or whatever they were doing in Drupal 7, that would be really beneficial, I think.
Do you think that it's not surprising that you think Backdrop is a great solution for people who find themselves stuck on Drupal 7 and like the way Drupal 7 is serving them? Maybe they are comfortable developing in Drupal 7 in the way that Drupal 7 is architected. Do you think that Backdrop has reached its full potential as far as not on the technology side, but as far as reaching those folks and capturing that part of the pie of folks that are still in Drupal 7?
I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily a priority. Like Backdrop is essentially Drupal 7, and if you'd written any custom code in Drupal 7, it's probably just going to work on Backdrop. You might have to change from variables to config, but that's usually the extent of the changes that are required. There's so much of what you can do in Backdrop that you can do either way. Like you can write block objects, or you can write block hooks, like however you wanted to build your block. Like we can do it the modern way, or we can do it the old way. And I don't think we need to be adding more things the old way. Like our new features all go in the modern way. And so what we're trying to do is build sort of a bridge to get people from, this is the way you did things in Drupal, here's a new API for Backdrop, works a little differently. And so then they're like, oh, well, maybe I'll build a layout plugin, and oh, this is object oriented, and they've accidentally learned how to do object
Right.
oriented code, which is a very different approach than Drupal that's like, oh, we're just going to adopt modern principles for everything, assuming we can get people who are like college educated computer scientists in here, right? Which is, it's a valid thing, especially for enterprise who's got an army of college educated computer scientists in
Yep.
their dungeon, right? Working on all of their other stuff. It makes sense to make that transition. But for us, we've just got people. They're just people,
Yeah.
maybe you've never done programming before, but they, opened a file and tinkered with it. And they're like, oh, I can do this. So how do we get those people slowly moved along the track to it? So in terms of like, I don't know that there is an end in potential. Like wherever the internet's going to go, it's going to go, and we're going to follow, right? It's the same thing for Drupal, same thing for us. It's just our audience is a little different. Like we're reaching people. Some of them know how to code. Some of them don't know how to code and do it anyway. And how do we make sure that those people can meet their goals? Like how can we help them? And so we have a very different sort of spectrum on what we're working with and trying to make things approachable and easy to learn. And that's a higher priority to us than like making all of the code object oriented.
Well, full disclosure for me, I did study computer science in college, so it's probably unsurprising that there are some pieces of more modern Drupal where I'm like, oh, this is more feels natural to me and like comfortable. But I want to highlight and recognize that I'm not beyond the idea that I am not everyone, and each of those things might suit different people in different ways.
Yep.
I'm also thinking though about maybe someone who is not even writing a line of code, but they are responsible for a site that is on Drupal 7 or many sites that are on Drupal 7.
Yep.
And we've talked a lot in previous episodes about, well, here are some different options that you have. One of them is getting to modern Drupal and some of the challenges that are, which is why why this is even a conversation to be having. If it was easy, we wouldn't be here. Backdrop is an option, and even other open source or other tools as options. But as someone who is working within Backdrop on the Backdrop project management committee, is Backdrop like, for you, are you like, this is the answer? Like all of these folks, for the folks that they like the Drupal 7 approach, like, is it a no-brainer to you? Is it a slam dunk that they should be coming to Backdrop?
Yeah. But from my perspective, like I know Backdrop, like I know its limitations, I know its benefits, and I also know that if I hit a limitation, I can fix it. Where I feel like there are some people who have less experience of both platforms might feel like they don't know if they can fix it here, but like maybe Drupal has a tool for it. And so they might feel more comfortable with a Drupal solution. For the people who are maybe not coders and maintaining a bunch of Drupal 7 sites, there are a lot of things that we've added to Backdrop to support that role, like automatic, maybe not automatic updates, manual updates. There's a button in core that says update core, and you push it and core updates, right? We've added package management into Backdrop itself, right? So rather than needing Composer to manage your packages, your module includes the library and the specific version it needs, and it manages its own packages. And you use the module user interface to like update your module or install your module or whatever it is. You don't have to leave your website. So we're trying to sort of solve the same problems that are solved in modern Drupal, but for that audience, like for the person who just clicks buttons in the interface of their website, we want to make it as easy as possible for them to stay on top of updates going forward. So that's the core updates, that's the contrib updates, module stats, whatever you need, major version updates, we're going to have a button there for them to push. And that doesn't mean that you can't manage your site in Composer or however else you want to do it, but you are smart enough to figure out how to do that on your own. So us in core are not going to support that. We're like, that's fine. You got this covered. People who need the most help are the people who need the buttons. And so that's how we're trying to help them through the process. That said, you're on Drupal 7, you don't have the update to Backdrop button, right? So the hardest point is getting from Drupal into Backdrop, and then from then on, you will have the support you need to carry on. I think with Drupal, it's a little different for those people because you can't necessarily run a Drupal 8 site in the same place you ran your Drupal 7 site, right? You have to have different infrastructure. You have to have more modern versions of everything. Now, hopefully everyone is updating their versions of PHP anyway.
Yeah.
But the reality is that like most of the internet is old internet. And so most hosting providers do support very old legacy versions of PHP. The good ones patch them and they keep them secure. When new issues come out, they will take care of them. But a lot of people just want to like drop in replacement for their Drupal 7 site and update it. Some people do that in production, scares me, but that's, WordPress people do that all the time. And they have a specific comfort level with just make a backup and do it, see what happens. And it, just restore the backup and it's totally fine. WordPress runs a lot of the internet. People have been figuring out how to do that for a long time. And so we're sort of trying to look at, Backdrop runs on PHP 8. It also runs on PHP 5.6, right? So like if you have a Drupal site running on an old platform, you should be able to drop in Backdrop and do your upgrade right there. So that's kind of what we're looking at too.
I think one of the sometimes confusing pieces of these communities, even as someone who's been a part of the Drupal community for close to 15 years or so, is we talk about the Drupal community, the Backdrop community, these other communities, but being an open source community, like, any of us can be part of these communities. You can go create an account on Drupal.org and congratulations, you are a part of the Drupal community and you can submit a patch or a merge request and like make a case for a change. So I want to highlight that when asking, especially as someone who's clearly a member of both communities, what is the level of responsibility that the Drupal community should feel for these folks on Drupal 7? What should we be doing more for them, and how important is that to Drupal as a product, the Drupal brand, the Drupal name?
Yeah. So something that I think you guys talked about in one of your really early episodes was, is it harmful to Drupal's reputation, the state we're in now, and whatever decision we make in the future? Like, how do you not harm the reputation of Drupal? And I think that, half of all Drupal 7 sites are still there. I don't know why, right? Like every one of them probably has their own reason for that. We can guess at what most of those are, but not taking care of those people, I think, is more harmful to the community than continuing to just move on with modern Drupal and ignore them. Now, I don't know what taking care of those people looks like, right? Like, I'm on the security team. I know what we've been talking about. I'm, listened to the long-term support option the way Drupal 6 had it. I don't know why that didn't work out for Drupal 7 in the same way, but I feel like there has to be some way to take care of those people. Obviously, I like to think the Backdrop is one way of taking care of those people. But I would love to see something in the Drupal community where those people don't feel quite so abandoned. I know that they have been feeling abandoned from personal experience. The people I've talked to anyway have been feeling abandoned. But yeah, I don't know, because of the like massive shift in audience, if there is a way to unabandon them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're at a point now where we've already made these technical decisions to move in this specific direction, and like bolting on things like project browsers as an afterthought doesn't bring them back. Like it doesn't undo the fact that they have to run Composer to install their site, or like there's just things that like yes, we're trying to fix that problem in different ways, but we've already told them we don't care about them. And so going back now and being like, never mind, we don't want to lose you, so we're going to try. It's just hard to recover from that damage. I feel like continuing to support the Drupal 7 platform, like you talked about before, it's both good and bad, right? Like we don't want to be there forever. The Drupal security team has a lot of work to do on modern Drupal. Like
Yeah.
continuing to backport solutions is not something they want to do. It's something we're working on in Backdrop. We're trying to like take over a little bit of that burden, but there's just a lot. There's a lot, a lot going on, and I would love to be able to see the Drupal community focus on what the Drupal community wants to focus on, which is modern Drupal. But how do you do that? Not leaving these people behind. I don't know. Is it can you recover from where we are
Hmm.
now? I don't know.
You know,
I feel like unfortunately we've gotten to a point where all of these people who are feeling abandoned are looking at other options that aren't Drupal. They might even not be free open source software anymore. Like we might have like sort of soiled their experience in such a way that they want something they know is going to be maintained, and if that's proprietary software and they just pay an annual fee or whatever it is, they're
right.
willing to do that now. Where when they moved on to Drupal, it was a very different pitch where it was just like, this is free, you can save so much money, we're going to collaborate and everyone does it together. And if they just made the shift on to Drupal when Drupal was first becoming enterprise in Drupal 7 with all of these promises, and then immediately got burned with the move to Drupal 8, they might be like, maybe that wasn't the right thought. And that's the opposite of what I want, is like an open source person. I'm like, no, 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 it's still good over here. It's still good. We just have to do it together. And I have a handful of sites running on Backdrop. I have a handful on Drupal 9, and I have a handful that are still on Drupal 7. And those people keep coming to me being like, what do we do? Like, what are our
Right.
options? When do we do it? How do we, like, we've got to save up to do it. Like, should we start saving now? How much do we need? And I keep telling them, look, there's 400,000 sites in your exact same position. Wherever you want to go, we're going to do it together, right? Like, even if it's not all 400,000 people going the same place, there's still going to be a community of people moving to Backdrop, a community of people moving to WordPress, a community of people moving to whatever you want to go to. There's going to be some people doing it, and we're going to be able to follow the trail on Stack Overflow or wherever they
Right.
are. And I think that gives people a little bit of confidence in that, okay, there's still benefit in collaboration. Maybe not what they originally envisioned, but like, I don't know, still, we can still do it together. So
I mean,
I'm,
even from a product perspective, when Drupal 7 was released, the landscape was completely different. So, there were just simply not as many options available for folks. And, the, if they wanted to do any number of things with their site, Drupal was maybe the best or only option for some of those scenarios, or at least a group of a small few set of options. Now, I mean, the web is more mature. The product options are much more numerous. So even from that perspective, there's a certain group of sites, I think, that whatever's gone on in the Drupal community aside, if they were being created today, they might not select Drupal. Drupal might not be the one and only fit to
yeah,
serve their need. I think that that's okay, and
yeah,
that's reality. But I think the sites where, if they're being created today, Drupal is still the best fit for them. It would be really disappointing if Drupal is not selected um, because of some kind of soiling of Drupal's reputation because of this, or because for large organizations, if Drupal is not in the same place in the Gartner quadrant, I don't even know what that means exactly, but I know it matters in a very big way to some people. So, I think for all of those perspectives and many more, that's why these folks that are on Drupal 7 still and feeling in some way that they're being left to, I mean, they were always kind of fending for themselves in a way, but really feeling unsupported, I guess would be a good way to describe it, is most concerning to me. From
yeah,
the perspective of these communities that anyone can be a member of, but let's point out too that there are people that are very involved. Their opinions carry a lot of sway. There's also groups within these organizations that do have control in some ways, like the security team, like the Backdrop Project Management Committee, like the Drupal Association, or Dries, as the project lead, is there an opportunity for collaboration between those groups on the Backdrop side and the Drupal side to work together in some way? And I don't know necessarily what that way is. I don't want to imply that it's a technical way or not, or a marketing like, but there's a lot of different options here. I'm curious if those discussions ever happen, or if you see those as a potential for positive change.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we've been sort of trying to collaborate with the Drupal community since the very beginning. Like, we had conversations with Drupal leadership even before we announced the fork, and we're like, hey, like, what if we did like a Drupal Lite or like a
Sure.
Drupal whatever?
Yeah.
And I understand at the time why the decision was no, right? Which, they had a lot of work to do on Drupal 8, and distracting anyone from that would have been detrimental to the Drupal project. So I get it. But like now we're in a point where we're like, okay, well, we have the same goal here. We have 400,000 Drupal 7 sites, and we want to help these people. How do we do that together? And we have had conversations with Drupal leadership today, Drupal Association members, people in the Drupal community who make decisions, security team. Like, there's a lot of places where we're talking to people, but the problem is we don't know how to do that, right? Or like,
Yeah.
where is the place we can work together? Is it in marketing? Are we building like Drupal.org advertisements for Backdrop? Like, that goes against the Drupal Association's mission. Like,
Sure.
there's just stuff that like it just doesn't make sense. Working together technically is hard because they're on GitLab and we're on GitHub, and like, how do you transfer a pull request from one to the other? Rebase, I don't know, but there's a lot of complicated issues where we don't really know how to make that work together. Both sides have acknowledged that we have a goal in common, and we want to figure out how we can take care of these people. We both have also conflicting thoughts about what might be the best solution for these people. In the Drupal community, it's like, well, how do we get them from Drupal 7 to Drupal 10? And in Backdrop, we're like, how do we get them from Drupal 7 to Backdrop, right? And so even though we have the same goal in helping them, like, our recommended solutions are different. So trying to give people like a decision tree might be valuable, where you're like, if your site does this, you should go to Squarespace. If your site does this, you should go to WordPress. Like, how do people make that decision, right? And of course, anything that's not Drupal in that decision tree is against Drupal Association's mission. So it's really hard to figure out how to work together. But yes, everyone in the Backdrop community is open to these conversations. We've been having them with various people. We still haven't gotten to a place where we have a collaborative thing we're doing, other than the security team. And the security team, our security teams have been collaborating for a very long time. We co-release security releases of Drupal and Backdrop on the same day when there's an issue that affects both platforms. I have been trying to help with other issues that maybe don't even affect Backdrop to try and earn some goodwill. And we have our own team that fields a lot of reports of potential security issues on the Backdrop side, and we handle them internally in our own private process too. If they also affect Drupal, we'll check to see if there's a Drupal issue, or if there's not, we might open one, or if Drupal has made a decision about that issue, that might come back into the Backdrop community. So we are trying to sort of transmit information and work together in that way. But that is like the easiest place we can collaborate, right? Yeah. And saying that the security team is the easiest place to collaborate really sort of puts into perspective how hard it is to find something very tangible that we can do immediately that benefits both projects and all of the people who are still in Drupal 7.
But one thing you mentioned that sticks with me is that despite the difference in missions between the two organizations, we're both facing the same concern, the same threat. It's the 400,000 sites that are still on Drupal 7. They are a risk to both groups. And if there's something to be gained by us collaborating and figuring out a mutually beneficial way to help those folks, what's the next step in this hard moment, in this challenging moment?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same thing it's been for Backdrop for a while, which is continue to build in backwards compatibility where it had been removed in early versions of Drupal 8, continue to provide more information, more examples, more assistance for people doing upgrades, maybe more content about people who have successfully done upgrades, like Stanford University moved a bunch of their heavily customized Drupal 7 sites onto Backdrop, and they saved hundreds of thousands of dollars over what it would have been to move to modern Drupal, mostly because of their very large investment into custom code. And having these success stories of people who are like, wow, like now we were able to put all this money towards other things that are important to our organization. Having people who've gone through that and had a really good experience. I think, Backdrop is a much smaller community than the Drupal community. We don't have a lot of people like blogging about that sort of thing. So trying to get that kind of information out is really important for us. Another thing that's really fascinating to us is that there is such a large portion of the Drupal community that doesn't know we exist, right? Like, I think it was in one of your first or second podcast, you said you guys had never done a backdrop upgrade and you didn't know it was involved. And I was like, how do these like Drupal agencies not know? And I feel like back when backdrop first forked, everyone kind of heard about it. And then everybody was sort of just was like, oh, well, Drupal's going this way, so I'm going to do that. And then once you've learned that, the incentive to learn the alternative is no longer really a priority, right? Where you're like, well, we know how to go this way now. We've learned all of the pitfalls and
You build
whatever.
expertise in a certain
Right.
way, and it becomes comfortable, and yeah, completely.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, well, all of these Drupal agencies that have been doing all of this Drupal 7 work whatsoever, everyone on their team has all the skills they need to work on Backdrop. Like they don't have to learn very much, but like they just don't want to. Right? They don't need to. I don't know, whatever the reason is.
Well, I
But I
think that
think,
there's like a question of specialization too. Like if you were saying, I could imagine someone saying like, we're a backdrop agency and we
yes.
specialize in getting people from Drupal 7 to backdrop, for example.
Yeah.
The other scenario is like, well, we've got all these sites on modern Drupal, and then is it worth, while to pitch a project, a migration to backdrop, and then we're maintaining one snowflake of a backdrop site with all of our other modern Drupal sites. Does
Yeah.
the tooling that we've created internally, does that work with that? Do we need to change it? Things like that. So there's momentum there for sure, but I don't think that's in any way passing judgment on backdrop as a viable or even great solution for some of these sites.
What I'm hoping is that now that we're reaching this point where people really have to make a decision about what they're going to do with their Drupal 7 sites, that reason to re-examine Backdrop is back on the table, right?
Yep.
Where for the past few years, for the sites that couldn't afford it or weren't sure, you said, well, we'll just wait and see, right? You're supported, you're fine, we'll wait and see. And so everybody's learned what it's necessary to build new sites in Drupal and move to modern Drupal and all of this stuff. And you have that information and you've been able to carry on as a successful business doing that. And now all of a sudden you have to worry about these Drupal 7 clients that haven't moved yet. And you have to think like, do we want to maintain these sites, right? Like if they're not going to move to Drupal, is it worthwhile for us to learn something new or not learn something new and move to back to rework on something old, whatever? Or should we say our business is in enterprise Drupal and we don't want to do that, anything else? And I've seen a lot of agencies specifically make that move where they're like, we don't need other business. Like there's so much business in enterprise Drupal and we've already got a good client base and we can continue getting new work in this area that we don't need it. But I think that the number of people who are in that position is fairly small. And that's part of what we're seeing is reflected in the number of Drupal 7 sites, right? Like all of the Drupal 7 sites that were managed by these companies that have these skills have moved because they can, right?
Right.
They've moved on. And the ones that can't, those are the ones that have been, built by the people who aren't developers or the agencies that are, WordPress and Drupal, maybe never super experts in Drupal, but could use Drupal. But now they're looking at modern Drupal and they're like, oh, that doesn't work anything like my WordPress stuff. So they're in the same boat. Do I want to support this Snowflake Drupal enterprise site? Or do I want more
Sure.
stuff that fits in with my WordPress flow? Or they're independent contractors. Like there's not very many independent contractors who do modern Drupal because they can get a good high paying job at an agency and
Right.
work remotely, right? And so trying to find an independent contractor to work for a few hours on a site is also really hard for
Mm.
organizations that don't do that themselves anymore. And so they're also stuck in trying to figure out where they're going to go to. And so I think some of what we're seeing now is these 400,000 Drupal 7 sites have to make a decision. They're going to go to their developers if they have them, or they're going to do the research on themselves if they don't, and they're going to see what the options are. And I'm hoping that that will encourage some of these Drupal agencies like your own that hasn't done this before to say, we really like this client. Maybe they have 4, modern Drupal sites, but they also have 4 Drupal 7 sites that don't need that platform. We can serve all of those needs within the skills we already have in our team, and that would become a new option. I also would like to think that some of these people who don't like Drupal 7 because it's years old will try Backdrop and go, oh, they fixed all those things I didn't like about Drupal 7.
Yeah.
So yes, it's still based on the old way that Drupal did things, but we've added in stuff for those people too, right? Like there's configuration management. I love configuration management. It makes everything so fast on
Absolutely.
modern
Yeah.
development platforms. Right, Backdrop has that. We have object oriented development. You want to write stuff as objects, you can't. That's fine. You can build all your things that way. You don't have to, because your old Drupal 7 stuff will still work. If you don't want to make that investment in rewriting it, you don't have to. But if you would rather write new stuff that way, you can. So I think it's just something where a lot of people who haven't looked at Backdrop since the very beginning think it's Drupal 7,
Right.
right? It's not. It's Drupal 7 plus 10 years of improvements. It's just a different priority set than where Drupal 8 went. And so it's, we still have the same features, right? A lot of the same stuff that's in Drupal core is in Backdrop core. It's just implemented slightly differently. Like our config is in JSON because it's 60 times faster. Our, their config is in YAML because they need YAML anyway for a bunch of other stuff. Like it's just decisions were made differently because we had different priorities. And it's the same problem has been solved. And so I'm hoping that, there's a bunch of people, I work on a couple of teams. There's a bunch of people on my teams who are like, I don't like Drupal 7, but give me a Backdrop site. I really want to work on it
Yeah.
because it is different enough. But hopefully it's also the same enough that you don't have to retrain your editors. It's just like, oh, this is slightly easier than before, right? Like slightly more intuitive for your site architecturals. We've made a lot of improvements to views and fields and layouts and added new tools everywhere and permission handling and stuff that should make it much easier for that person too. So yeah, I don't know. I would encourage everyone who hasn't looked at Backdrop in the last 10 years to have a look because
Check it out.
it's not Drupal 7.
Okay, last question. You mentioned earlier, discussions that happened near the early days of Backdrop. You even mentioned discussions around calling it Drupal Lite or something like that. Do you think having the name Drupal in the title, or in this case, not having Drupal in the title, not being called Drupal Lite, not being called Backdrop, a Drupal descendant, or whatever it is, do you think if it did have that in the title, that it would make a big difference? Like, is that a big barrier for recognition and discoverability, or even the feeling of security? Like, not technical security, but a feeling of like, oh, I'm moving to, I'm not switching platforms here. This is a part of the same platform and family.
Yeah, I'm a little ambivalent about that because it's not, right?
Mhm.
And so saying that it is would be a little misleading, and trying
Okay.
to figure out, like, even if it did become part of the family, it would operate so differently than the rest of the family that I'd still feel like that would be misleading. And so I think just naming it Drupal, um, yes, it would allow us to be more recognizable. And people would be like, oh, it's Drupal. I trust Drupal. Therefore, I trust Backdrop. But at the same time, as soon as they look at it or use it or, maintain it for a while, we break that trust. Right, because it's not what they thought it was,
Mm.
and I'm concerned about that. When we first started talking about name, trademark, what have you, I was very much in the boat that, like, we need this to prove that we're, I don't know, real or whatever it was. And a whole bunch of people in the Backdrop community were like, no, 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 you can't do that because we're here because it's not Drupal. And so if you're looking at these 400,000 sites that are like, we are over Drupal, they have left us behind, we don't have a path forward, it's way too expensive, we don't like it. Coming to something that's not Drupal is really beneficial for them. And so our community is split between these, like, people who love Drupal and are here because it's Drupal, and people who hate Drupal and are here because it's not Drupal.
Right.
And so putting the name in there, I think, really sways it towards, only half of our community. We'd be splitting our community in the same way that, Drupal 7 people got split. So yeah, I'm ambivalent on it. I mean, I do see the credibility that it would add by being a Drupal family member, but I also see the passion that people have for it being not Drupal. It works differently than Drupal. Decisions are made differently than Drupal. Process is different than Drupal. Development is different than Drupal. Like, all of the things that are different is why they're here. Right. And it's why we're here. Right. Because we saw how Drupal, Nate and I were neck deep in, like, Drupal core development. We saw how it worked, and we're like, we can make some improvements on this. We're going to try something else. And, I don't know if they're improvements or not, but they're different. And I think that there are a lot of people who are really enjoying those differences. And so, yeah, I'm ambivalent. I feel like
I think about
it is
too,
hard.
you mentioned, those strong feelings and the diversity of those feelings. I also always come back to think about the folks who have no idea about nearly any of this.
Yep.
And, they know that, they might be a manager of some kind, and, they know that they have sites on Drupal, and uh, know that they need to move off of the version of Drupal that they're on, but maybe they've heard of Backdrop, maybe they haven't, maybe they know a little bit about what's going on in the Drupal community, but maybe they don't. Maybe they don't have a user name on a user account on Drupal.org, let alone going through the Backdrop issue queue or anything like that. So I'm always trying to remember when we're having these conversations, those folks as well. Like, there's so much inside baseball that you and I and everyone that we've talked to on this podcast know about. But that's probably not, we are not in the big portion of the pie when it comes to the people responsible for those certainly the ones that are responsible for those 400,000 Drupal 7
Yeah.
sites.
I know personally, like, a handful of the Drupal 9 sites that I work on. The people that I work with don't make any decisions about what the platform is. Like, there's people above them that made the decision, maybe people above them that made the decision. And for them, it's just like, oh, we're out of date, we need to update. And then we go, here's the estimate. And they're like, what? Right. But it isn't
Sure.
even like, they don't understand what an upgrade is, and why is this different from the updates we do every, like,
Sure.
the Drupal community is full of all of these, like, terminology that those of us who are really deep into it understand. But from a decision maker, someone who signs the bills, that's really hard. And for them, they might just be like, oh, it's going to be expensive, I'm going to put it on the back of my table and we're going to worry about it later. And they don't ever consider other options. They're just like, okay, we'll eventually get to this thing and we'll do it. Or they'll be like, okay, well, if it's going to cost this much, like, how much would it cost to just build a new site? Right. And sometimes they
Absolutely.
look at that in modern Drupal, and then you can be like, well, we can, but then we can also migrate, and you can sort of sell them on the upgrade. But sometimes they might be like, oh, it's so expensive, I'm just gonna, my friend does WordPress, we're just gonna do that instead. And or this other other part of my organization has a custom Laravel application or whatever it is,
Yeah.
they've got experience in something else, and that's what they're going to look at. And that I feel like is bad for Backdrop because they're not doing the research, right? And Backdrop doesn't have that experience for them to lean on to move over to it. But also, even if they did do the research, if they don't know why Drupal 8 is more expensive, is Backdrop going to be like appealing to those people, right? So yeah, there's definitely, it's hard to reach those people. Um, there's also like you mentioned, there's so many more options for people right now. And I have as an independent contractor, I have several clients that they were like, what should I do? And I'm like, you should try WordPress or well, you should try Wix or whatever, I think that would be best for them. And it's hard for me to, say goodbye to these people that maybe I've been working on sites for a decade or so. But like at the end of the day, it's better for them, right?
Yep.
And so I'm happy to see them go. And so at the same time, as much as I'd love to have more Backdrop sites, I still feel like I have to do what's best for each client.
Absolutely.
And what I think that means for what we need to do is find a way to help these people make that decision. Like there's people who don't know, how do you evaluate, right? Like you're a business manager, you have an estimate on your table, but that's it. How do you know whether you can move your site to WordPress? Like I've had some of my Drupal 7 projects move to WordPress for other reasons, and they get there and my phone rings and they're like, we don't have any of the things that we had on the Drupal 7 site. And I'm like, yeah, well, WordPress isn't really very good at that. Like we can add these things on, but like, that's not really, I can direct you to some WordPress people who can help you with that, but it's not really my thing. And they're like, but this was working before. And you're like, yeah, well, you chose a system that doesn't do that. And they don't know, right? It's the same thing. So I don't know how to solve this problem because this is not a Backdrop problem or a Drupal problem. It's like a web sphere problem.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's the problem we're facing, is that we have all of these people that don't know what to do. They might not even know they need to do anything. When they find out they need to do something, are they going to be able to evaluate their options? I don't know. I hope I hope Backdrop's one of them. I hope Modern Drupal's one of them. I would like to see these people stay in the open source family. I still feel like Backdrop and Drupal are sort of the same family. Like most of the people in the Backdrop community also do Drupal. There are a handful of our Backdrop agencies that don't want to work in Drupal ever again. But yeah, I still feel like there's a lot of collaboration, and it's I would like to see more people choose the right tool for the job. I feel like when you take a small site and put it on Drupal 8, they get mad. I feel like if you take a really complicated site, try and put on WordPress, they get mad. And I feel like there is a solution for everyone. And if we can get everyone onto whatever platform it is, they're going to be happiest, and they're going to be most happy about the open source world if you can show them an open source product that's perfect for them. I'm hoping that of the Drupal 7 sites remaining, there are a fair number that are managed by agencies who are currently doing modern Drupal. And then they will say, we want to keep these clients, and we want, for all of our current enterprise clients, we want them to come to us for all of their needs. And if we can meet their needs with a smaller tool or a different model, we're going to do that too, because they already have those skills. So that's kind of where I'm seeing.
Where can people find you online or find out more about Backdrop?
Backdrop is at backdropcms.org. I used to say I was on Twitter. I don't know. I am active in GitHub for Backdrop. Backdrop itself also has a live chat system. We use Zulip, free open source chat platform. It's a lot like Slack. You can usually find me there too. Backdrop does have a Slack channel. I don't know what it is, but we're mostly
in the show notes. We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
I will be at DrupalCon in a few short weeks in Pittsburgh. So if you are listening to this, please come say hello. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about Drupal 7 End of Life while we are in Pittsburgh together. And Jen, will you be there?
I will not.
Okay, well, we will miss you in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But I'm sure your ears will be ringing.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for joining today. This has been amazing.
Of course. It was fun to chat.